Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be walking you through my method for creating beautiful stylized environments with Blender and Unity. This is not a video about basic modeling or how to use the softwares, rather we will mostly be talking about my personal process and the theory behind it, in the hopes that you might find something interesting and be able to apply it to your own workflow. Since this is mostly about theory and process, the ideas we talk about here will be applicable to other 3D software and game engines as well, but I'm using Blender and Unity because that's my software of choice. The demonstration scene that I've created here follows my personal style, which can be briefly described as the use of vibrant, often emissive elements used to complement flat shaded geometry. Lighting comes in two forms here, which are geometric, as in the case of the emissive lines and contours, and atmospheric, such as where we have volumetric lighting coming from off-screen. This is the style that I'm going to be replicating today, so we won't be using any textures or light baking. I'll show you the basic steps I took to make this and explain some of the thought processes as we go. Before we jump into this, there are a few key things to keep in mind. This is entirely improvised. When I'm doing environments in this unrealistic style, I typically don't have any references or inspirations because experimentation is a core part of this design loop that we'll touch on later. I do, however, have a few personal guidelines that I can use to help guide the thinking process if I'm stuck in a situation where I don't know what to add or change to the environment. These guidelines are as follows. Can I project a basic shape onto the environment and have it guide the flow? Can I incorporate repeating elements of detail? Can I incorporate symmetry? And can I incorporate both styles of lighting, which are geometric and atmospheric? If I follow these, I usually end up with something that I like the look of, so let's go ahead and see how this works in practice. I generally start off thinking of a layout from a first-person perspective. For the case of this environment, I was imagining an L-shaped pathway which turned off to the left at the end. On the left-hand side, I thought it would be cool to incorporate repeating elements of pillars with slanted overhanging structural pieces. On the right, there would be opportunity to have a padded, possibly inset wall of details. The spaces on the left in between the pillars could also provide an opportunity to bleed light into the scene, emanating from an energy source below. This is a technique that I mentioned in my tips for atmospheric lighting video. When I have a general idea in my mind, the way I bring it to life is to start with a blockout which will be contained within a single file. Usually when you are creating environment art for video games, especially if they are modular in design, you need to do some pre-planning to design and build specific pieces that will be used to construct the environment beforehand. Pieces that are going to repeat only need to be created once, as they can be turned into prefabs and recycled as many times as you like inside of the engine. However, when I'm starting out with a vague and incomplete idea, I disregard this pre-planning and instead choose to opt for a more destructive approach, where I will block out a basic silhouette for the entire scene in Blender and then select and export all of the constituent objects as a single file, usually in an FBX format. After that, I will then drag that single object straight into the hierarchy in Unity so I can start positioning cameras and lights. The reason I disregard prior planning and do the blockout this way, rather than create individual pieces to construct it out of inside of the engine, is because this allows for great control over rapid prototyping. What I mean by this is that due to the way that Unity synchronizes files with imported content, if I want to make quick destructive changes to the blockout in Blender, I can quickly re-export everything, tab over to Unity, and then the changes will automatically take effect without me having to manually re-import the content. What's also useful is that any overriding changes to individual objects, such as material changes, will be preserved even if I change the contents of the file. For example, if I provide some of the objects with space for emissive outlines, then I can choose a specific material for that geometry using the appropriate material slot. I can then easily change the color and properties by swapping it with another material, and when I make further changes to the blockout file in Blender, these material choices in Unity will stay the same. With useful scripts attached to the cameras, I can now walk around this early three-dimensional sketch with a first-person perspective and let myself get inspired by the space. Keeping in mind that I am completely improvising, while I am looking around, I will often come to the conclusion on next steps I want to take and visualize layers of detail I would like to see further down the line. It's also important for me to mention here that the blockout will likely not represent what the end result of the environment will look like. Since this is improvisation, while creating content, we work on an endless design loop of making changes, being inspired and generating new ideas from those changes, and then using those ideas and creating more changes. This means that depending on how much freedom to change you want to give yourself, the end result could end up evolving into something completely different. I should also mention here that I am making use of third-party tools to get extra lighting and post-processing effects. For the volumetric lighting, I'm using Aura 2. As well as that, I often make use of the different tools provided by Amplify Creations, as well as Sonic Ether's Natural Bloom and Beautify by Connect. Now let's move on to the next phase. After I feel happy with the blockout and I know what direction I want to take it in, I'll move on to a reconstruction phase, which is where I start to split the blockout into individual repeatable modular pieces in Blender, which I will then turn into prefabs inside of the game engine. When making these changes, I make sure to stick to the 3D grid as best as I can, making sure that the origins of objects are in appropriate places on that grid, ensuring that the pieces will fit together properly inside of the engine. I will go through this before starting to add extra layers of detail to the environment, because the later you leave this phase, the more effort it will take to clean up the project later on. At the end of this reconstruction phase, I end up with a scene that looks almost identical to the blockout, but now I know that I have a collection of individual prefabricated objects that I can manipulate and add more detail to without having to worry about project file cleanup later on. This is where I begin to move on to detailing. When it comes to adding detail objects to the scene, there are a few tricks I make use of to keep myself from getting mentally stuck in one place for a long time. What you really need to do is keep trying to find new angles of approach to give yourself a fresh perspective on your creation. 2D artists quite often do this by flipping their work horizontally to reset their perspective, but in 3D there's more we can do to help with this. One thing I like to do is set up a collection of cameras at an interesting variety of angles, and then I tell myself that it's my goal to turn each of those camera shots into an individual art piece. What this means is that I'll start adding details from different perspectives, and then in the end, I'll end up with a collection of nice beauty shots, as well as an environment that should look cool all around just as a consequence of creating that sequence of images. In the process of going through the first iterations of detailing, I've ended up creating these elements of wall padding as well as other mechanical silhouettes. At this point, I wasn't satisfied with just this corner area and decided that the environment needed to have a larger intrinsic purpose to it, so I went back to my original guidelines for this particular style of environment. Now, we're already using repeating elements in our design with these mechanical structural pieces, and I don't want to overdo it, so we've got that covered. However, I realized I could definitely incorporate symmetry here. An L-shaped pathway is kind of awkward to compose by itself, but if I mirrored the pathway over to the other side, then it would open up a wide range of possibilities for interesting composition and detailing in between. This is the direction I end up taking, and in doing so, I end up with a situation where I have been presented with the opportunity to create an interesting point of focus in between the symmetrized elements. This mirror line is an excellent place to put the camera to get some establishing shots. In fact, I've done it quite a lot in the past, as you can see here. You can also offset the camera from the mirror line to get some other interesting angles, like so. For this composition to look cool, however, it requires a good use of a focus point along the center line. I could put anything here, a window looking out into space, a suspended spaceship turning this into a hangar, or even some fiery industrial machinery chugging away. But today I feel like I'm wanting to go for something a bit more subtle and abstract, which is more typical for my style. Looking back, the first one is, can I project a basic shape on the environment and have it guide the flow? Almost like you're tracing it into 3D space using physical details. If we take a look back at some of my old work, you can actually see that I've been doing this for quite a while. What I decided to do for the center is project a geometric diamond shape and then make it a bit more fanciful through the use of repeating elements. Following that, I'll add some emissive contouring to guide the flow and fill in some empty space. I like having emissive lines offset by darkened plane geometry because it balances out other areas of the scene where there are more tightly packed structures. But now that we've got this nice looking scene, is there anything we can add to it to make it a bit more interesting to look at? Well, this is where we come onto the balance of symmetry versus asymmetry. I think to make a scene more compelling to look at, and even slightly more realistic despite it being stylized, is the subtle use of asymmetrical details. A way I like to think of it is that we can use symmetry to set the stage, and asymmetry to tell a story inside of that stage. Environmental storytelling is where you leave details in the scene which imply a history. In fact, the presence of light itself implies that something is alive and working, even if only digitally. We can see some examples of where I've done this in the past. In this temple hallway, the structure is architecturally symmetrical, but littered around are a variety of details on each side. For this portal scene, again the structure is symmetrical, but the glyphs around the portal are not the same. As well as this, the edges of the stone structures do not mirror across to the other side. In this scene, we can see that the balance has actually been flipped, where the main symmetrical element is the giant sphere in the center, and everything surrounding it is seemingly random asymmetrical detail. Keeping that in mind, I went back to do one more layer of detailing to see if I could make the scene a bit more compelling. If you look carefully, there is a slight indication of asymmetry, especially with the emissive elements. So now that we're approaching the end of this, I want to show you one of the reasons why I like working with flat materials without color data imposed by textures. I like experimenting with the look of different colors, which is something I briefly mentioned in my tips for concepting video. One of the ways you can do this is by shifting the hue, but of course this changes all of the color in the scene, which is annoying in the case where you want to keep emissive accents the same. You can also just change the colors of the lights in the scene, but another method I like to use as well is shifting the base color of the common surface material from grayscale to an actual color, and then shifting that around. We can end up with a wide variety of moods without affecting the color data of lighting or emissive elements. This gives us a lot more precise control over the presence of color in the scene. This is a style I'm still experimenting with, and I'll continue to do so in the future. Once I nail it down, I'll consider building a generative system that constructs randomized environments like this for me. Now I think that's where we'll leave it for now. If you've enjoyed this video, then don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell. You can also follow me on social media to stay up to date on content. If you like, you can also join our Discord server to take part in discussions and share your work. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.